All right, let's get right into this explainer. Today, we're unpacking a truly fascinating, gonzo-poetic text that basically wants to completely rewire how you think about world history. We're looking at a source that just tosses the traditional textbook narratives right out the window. Instead, it asks us to look at history not as this nice straight line of human progress, but as an inescapable corporate feedback loop. I know, it's a heavy, wildly provocative concept, but we're going to break it down step by step and see exactly how this author connects the very founding of corporate America all the way over to the brutal realities of the Tibetan Civil War. So here's the core question the text uses to hook us right from the jump. Think about this for a second. What if the history of the world isn't a timeline at all? What if it's actually just a repeating corporate feedback loop? The author is suggesting that even though borders move and eras change, the deep underlying engine of human civilization, that drive for extraction and control, is just constantly looping back on itself. It really demands that we look past all those patriotic stories we're so used to and focus on the cold, hard mechanics of how power actually operates. To get a grip on this loop, the text actually takes us back to the founding of the United States. And the argument here is pretty radical. It claims that early European colonizers, the Spanish, French, English, they didn't cross the ocean carrying these pure ideals of liberty. The text says they brought something called the binary. We'll dig into that term in a second, but the main point is that the 13 colonies were essentially set up as literal corporations. They had boards of directors, they had dividend structures, and your one absolute goal was extraction, whether it was tobacco in Virginia, cod in Massachusetts, or tragically, a whole system built on the extraction of human flesh through slavery. The text insists the colonies were never about freedom. They were just business ventures. And the source text takes this corporate framework and boldly maps it right onto our most sacred historical events. So instead of that traditional narrative we all grew up with, the author gives us this incredibly controversial reframing. The Revolutionary War? Not actually a revolution. According to this, it was just a corporate secession. The colonial board of directors basically just got tired of sending their profits back to London, which means the Declaration of Independence was just a press release, and the Constitution, a terms of service agreement, one written by men who literally owned other human beings and didn't see any contradiction there because all men are created equal only applied to the authorized men, like themselves.
Okay, which brings us to this foundational concept, the binary. The author defines this as a system of absolute control that splits the entire world into two very stark categories, the authorized and the unauthorized. Now, the text points to the American Civil War as the exact moment this binary was truly locked in. The author argues that, beneath the obvious headline of slavery, the real structural fight was over centralization. When the North won, the U.S. stopped being this loose collection of individual corporations and became one giant centralized corporation. Suddenly you had a standing army, fiat currency, a sweeping tax code. The binary became absolute, right? One tax ID, one authorized soul.
Working right alongside the binary is what the author calls the factory. You can think of this as the relentless humming engine of the global state. The factory is this force that constantly, relentlessly demands conformity, productivity, and expansion. To give you an idea, the text frames the Cold War not just as a fight against communism, but as a war of containment against literally any alternative idea. It was a war against the very thought that society could be organized in any way other than this binary factory model. So you might be wondering what happens when people actually try to reject this system. Well, the text highlights a few movements that tried refusing the factory. You have groups like the Viet Cong and the Sandinistas on a global scale, and then domestically you've got the San Francisco counterculture of the 1960s. The Beats, the hippies, the diggers. The text frames all these groups as people basically just asking, hey, what if we stopped being a corporation? But the state's response to that question is absolute crushing force. Abroad, it was napalm. At home, as the source notes, it was COINTELPRO, the war on drugs, and the systematic dismantling of any alternative community that got a little too visible or threatened that binary. And that brings us to the absolutely crucial thesis of this whole text, recursion. Recursion is a historical feedback loop. The author wants us to see that history isn't a line at all. It's a net. The power dynamics, the extraction, the binaries, they just endlessly repeat themselves over time. The presidents change. We go from Reagan to Clinton to Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden. But the underlying corporation, that just keeps humming along. The system eats itself, reboots, and does it all over again. To make this super concrete, the text draws these direct, repeating parallels across centuries of history. Take the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882, where immigrant labor was used to build railroads and then brutally discarded. The text argues that recurs in the modern era as the Uyghur camps in 2020. The underlying logic and the binary are exactly the same. Literally only the names have changed. Or look at the historical Opium Wars. The author maps that directly onto today's fentanyl crisis. The ancient Silk Road, that's today's Belt and Road Initiative. The argument is that everything happening right now has already happened, or it's happening at the exact same time somewhere else. So, this massive, sweeping overview of global history actually builds up to the author's ultimate test case, the Tibetan Civil War. The text brings this specific conflict in to prove that this corporate recursive logic applies everywhere, even to the most isolated, high-altitude places on the planet. The text starts by breaking down Tibet's internal structure, and it reveals that Tibet had its own historical binary going way before any external forces ever showed up. On one side, you have the Gelugpa monastic system. They held the land, the wealth, and the law dating back to the 17th century. They essentially merged religion and state to extract labor from the peasantry. And fiercely opposing them, you had the Khampa, these fierce warriors and farmers from the eastern grasslands. The text points out that the Khampa deeply resented the theocracy. They hated the tax collectors from Lhasa, and they rejected a system that basically measured your loyalty to the Buddha in grain and silent obedience. So right off the bat, you have a deeply unstable binary. Now, this is where the author's assessment gets incredibly blunt and impartial. When the Chinese Communist Party turned its attention toward Tibet in the 1950s, their official line was that they were coming to liberate the serfs. And the author points out that, structurally speaking, they weren't entirely lying. The monastic order really was a feudal order. The serfs were real, and that massive inequality was a reality. The text doesn't romanticize the old Tibetan system at all. It just identifies it as another extractive binary that was totally ripe for a crisis. If you look at the timeline of this conflict, it tracks the text's theory of recursion perfectly. You've got the 17th century monastic rules setting up that initial binary, then boom, the 1950s happen and the Chinese Red Army arrives. Caught right in the dead center of this is the 16-year-old Dalai Lama, trapped between a massive invading army and his own fractured, divided nobles. The Khampa, who were already used to fighting the Lhasa government, immediately pivot to rebelling against the Chinese in the mid-50s. All of this chaos culminates in the 1959 exile of the Dalai Lama and ultimately the complete devastation of the Cultural Revolution in the late 1960s. But here is where the author directly confronts the stuff that standard American history books tend to, accidentally on purpose, leave out. Right in the middle of this massive internal fracture in Tibet, the CIA got involved. And according to the text, the reason this gets omitted isn't even because it's some deeply held secret, but because exposing it just makes the cold mechanics of the global factory a little too obvious. The text lays out the brutal specifics here. The American intelligence apparatus looked at Tibet and just saw a proxy theater for the Cold War. It was just a convenient, far-off place to bleed the Chinese military. So the CIA literally dropped weapons to the Khampa fighters. They secretly trained Tibetan guerrillas in camps in Colorado and out on the island of Saipan. They promised them American air support that, of course, never actually came. As the text states plainly, the Americans used them and then they dropped them. These Tibetan warriors who just wanted to fight and die on their own soil were completely swallowed up by a much bigger machine, the Cold War recursion. And the aftermath described by the source is just horrific. By the time the Cultural Revolution swept through in the late 60s, the text argues that the old feudal order actually looked gentle by comparison. Ancient monasteries were sacked, irreplaceable texts were burned to ash, and monks and nuns faced horrific violence. The very sacred geography of the place was essentially erased. The text cites that over 1 million Tibetans died, maybe more. It's an absolutely staggering number, and it represents the crushing, undeniable weight of these two massive systems colliding. The author sums up this whole tragedy with a really haunting conclusion. They write, "The binary of the Chinese state replaced the binary of the Gelugpa theocracy, and the people in between, the Khampa in between, the ones who had refused both, were erased." And that is the core tragedy of this whole framework. Power doesn't actually disappear. It just swaps out one binary for another one. And the people who try to live outside the factory, the people who refuse to pick a side of the coin, they are the ones who just get ground down and erased by the recursion. As we wrap up this explainer, the author leaves us with one final thought on the nature of history itself. The text argues that this recursive, corporate, incredibly bloody feedback loop, that is the real history. And the crazy part is, it's not hidden away in some classified vault somewhere. It's hiding in plain sight. It's obscured precisely because it is so obvious. When a system controls the textbooks and the tax code and the authorized binaries of a society, it turns out it's incredibly easy to hide the truth, simply by making it feel completely normal. So, what is the big takeaway here? Well, the source material doesn't exactly offer a simple, feel-good way out, but it does demand some serious self-reflection. If history really is a net, and we are all living inside this repeating corporate feedback loop that just constantly replaces one form of extraction with another, then the final, completely unavoidable question this text forces us to ask ourselves is this: where are you caught in the net of the recursion? Keep questioning the timeline and keep looking for the loop. Thanks for exploring this one with us.